You are listening to That Hoarder Overcome Compulsive Hoarding, combating stigma since 2021. I wanted there to be a podcast about hoarding disorder from somebody who hoarded rather than a professional. That didn't exist, so I created it. And that's this podcast that you're listening to now. Subscribe to the podcast and find my social media links, episode transcripts, and every link that I mention at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk. Finally, I am not a doctor. I'm just a hoarder doing her best. So do seek professional support if and when you need it. So I am here with Dr Jan Eppingstall, the inimitable counsellor in Melbourne, Australia, who works with people who hoard. Jan, how are you?
I'm very well.
Good.
Very well. And yourself?
I'm doing pretty well, thank you.
Excellent.
So today we are talking about Kintsugi, which is an ancient Japanese art of repairing broken things with gold. Cracks and breaks are fixed with visible gold lines where the cracks once were, creating beauty from the item's previous fragility. We are going to talk about what relevance this could have for people who hoard and how we can use this concept to help us all in our own lives. So, Jan, you recently did a Kintsugi workshop yourself. What first got you interested in it and what made you suggest it? Because sometimes I think of topics for our episodes, sometimes you do.
Yes.
What made you suggest this one as a topic for today?
Well, as you and listeners probably remember, I do love Japanese culture, and I've recently visited Japan with my family. I came across the traditional art of Kintsugi when I lived in Japan in the 2000s, and I felt it would be I thought, that'll be a wonderful way if I ever have to bring life back to something broken that might have a history for me. And recently, when my mother moved into care accommodation, there was a Chinese vase that had been in the family for many, many, many years, had unfortunately broken. And I decided, I know about this thing, Kintsugi, I'll go and try a class and learn how to repair ceramics with gold. Little did I know that I would need to practice so much to hone this skill. So I have yet to even think about touching this precious Chinese vase. But the reason I suggested this topic was based on my experience learning the craft and talking to Jun Sensei, my teacher, about the kind of philosophy behind it, because he was very keen to sort of describe what this art means in Japan and also how it came about. Like, he went through all the history and all that kind of thing, which was really wonderful to have as a backdrop with the workshops. And I will also say that I continue to learn. I go to Kintsugi Dojo once a month where I take along something that I'm working on, and he kind of guides me. It's a lovely process. It's great. And there's other people there doing their own projects. So it's actually opened up a whole new bunch of people that I can interact with.
Amazing.
Which I'm excited about, yeah.
So I don't think I'll be alone in that the idea of feeling broken or damaged is a common theme in my life. I often feel broken. I sometimes believe I'm irreparably broken. I often use those very words about myself. So the idea of Kintsugi is a powerful one, but it's important to be clear we're not using this episode to oversimplify. When have we ever oversimplified? And say, it doesn't matter how hurt you've been, how damaged you've been, it's okay, you can come out better and more beautiful. When we dive beyond the pure aesthetics of it, as you were saying, there's a whole philosophy behind this. It's not a dismissive or minimizing idea. It's a very nuanced and complex thing. Amy Price wrote an article called My Pandemic Grief and the Japanese Art of Kintsugi and said, the obvious damage shows the time and care that went into the repair. So one aspect of this is that we can take pride in the fact that when we build ourselves back up, cracks and all, we've done so with immense work and care. Kintsugi is a time-consuming process when pottery breaks, just like repair after trauma, grief, poverty, neglect are all also time-consuming, but all the more worth it when we do take that time and care, right?
Exactly.
One of the key themes that came up a lot in my reading was through Kintsugi, we see that vulnerability is not the same as weakness. There's a book by Thomas Navarro about Kintsugi, and I need to start by saying I kind of hated this book.
Me too. I didn't finish it.
It was strange because parts of it were incredibly insightful and moving. Other parts of it, he was glib and insultingly trivializing. That wasn't just me that got that, right?
No.
One of my
Oh.
notes from when I was reading it quoted him saying, "Suffering is never in vain if we're able to learn something from it." And then I just wrote lots of swear words. But with the warning that he can be weirdly dismissive, let's talk about what this book tells us. So one of the things that I thought was useful was that Navarro talks about how healing takes action. He says, your life will not spontaneously heal. Don't wait for something to happen merely by dint of desiring it, because desire alone is not enough to heal our lives. And he also said later, abuse, suffering, and adversity leave a wound in your soul that requires your willpower and action to heal. So what does this tell us?
Before I talk about that, I will admit that I highlighted exactly the same quotes that you have. And I also wanted to just I'm not sure if it was the translation. Perhaps I'll give him the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah.
But there was oftentimes, like you, I was kind of, oh, that was a bit abrasive. That was a bit. But there were a couple of gems in there. I haven't finished it. I will admit that right now. I bought it. I actually paid money for the book. So I will finish it eventually. If I've bought something, I do tend to try and read it. But learning the art of Kintsugi demonstrates that repair takes time, right? And it's that ongoing process. Each stage in the process needs to be completed mindfully and carefully. It's a very step-by-step process. And then you need to leave it to solidify and become stronger so that the object can then resume its purpose. And you even have to have a special environment to put it into. So it's a thing called a muro, which is a box which you have to keep at a certain temperature with a certain amount of humidity. So it needs the environment to become stronger, which I think is really core. Also, if one of the steps isn't completed to your satisfaction, then the object might not, say, for example, hold water. So that stage will need to be repeated until those cracks are sealed, and then the next stage can begin. In translation, we need to understand that action needs to be taken to heal. The bowl won't magically fuse back together without a lot of care and energy on your part. We have to do something to bring those pieces of ourselves together and do something to actually make them one again. But it is about the fact that it's an ongoing process. There's stages of that process. It needs a particular environment in order for it to solidify. And sometimes you have to go back and repeat stages. So it's actually a really clever metaphor for healing yourself from trauma and other types of suffering.
Some of the visual imagery from Navarro's book spoke to me. I'm going to read a few paragraphs here that I appreciated. Stoop down calmly and start picking up each and every one of the pieces of your soul. Do it conscientiously, taking your time, taking care to not pick up any dirt along with the pieces. Don't get them confused. When picking up the pieces of your broken soul, don't also carry with you those useless, toxic emotions. Pick up the pieces without impurities. Actively decide what you will and will not bring with you when starting this new chapter of your life. Take your time, digest what has happened, lay out the pieces, examine them, and make sure you didn't leave any behind. Put them into order and feel them. Each and every one of them has something to tell you. Don't put them together any old way. Don't be clumsy or rough. Any piece fits in perfectly with the rest. Don't force the reconstruction. If something doesn't fit, there's a reason for it. Start over if you need to, but don't force a repair if you don't have everything ready and prepared. You are not a prisoner of your fate, mistakes, or misfortunes. You are the creator of your own life, the leading actor. And it kind of blows my mind that such beautiful words occur in the same book as the man who at one point says, I don't care about your past. Don't tell me about your past. I don't care about your past. It's the weirdest thing. But I am interested in why mental imagery like this can feel so much more precise than more literal words do. In a different paper, as always, I will link to all of these on the website, but a different paper by Hideki Sherb said, when traumatic experiences are beyond words, people turn to metaphor to express painful memories. Does that, in your work as a therapist, resonate with you?
Definitely. And ACT is huge with metaphors, to be honest. So there's the quicksand metaphor, the monsters on the bus, the tug of war, the Chinese finger trap metaphor. There's so many, and they're really fantastic to use in therapy, especially when a client doesn't seem to be able to follow kind of the intellectualized concepts. Often kind of more concrete examples from the real world are really effective. Us humans, we like stories, and metaphors tap into that preference, and we can use that for greater translation of concepts in the therapy room. And as this person Hideki was suggesting, when clients bring metaphors, it's how they are able to actually, because the whole body is involved within that traumatic experience. So often it's metaphors really allow them to explain that and express that. When clients use metaphors themselves to describe their experiences or maybe spontaneously describe a relationship or event, using one of their own metaphors can be really useful, because the client's metaphor can then be a shorthand in future sessions to kind of go, oh, you're going back into turtle mode, or whatever it might be. Whatever they've used will tap into that concept really quickly, and it will give them the idea of what you're meaning with your maybe summarization or reflection. So metaphors are brilliant. Metaphors are really, really good.
And I've found in therapy situations, as the client, obviously, if I say something like, I'm drowning, and the therapist goes with that and was like, right, how do you get to the surface? Is there a life raft nearby? And also, I'm drowning can sum up what would take me 1,000 words to try and explain.
Exactly. It's so powerful because it just builds that picture. I love that saying. I can't remember who, I don't know if it was Steve Hayes, but it's a picture you can walk into, and you can really walk into that picture and investigate, can't you, with the person, either with your client or with your therapist. It is very powerful.
In research, I was surprised actually by how many mental health issues and traumas have been looked at through the lens of the Kintsugi philosophy. So, one paper by Olivia Harris and colleagues was about Kintsugi and psychosis. And they say throughout this review, we were struck by the way this initially shattering experience of experiencing psychosis could become a tool in which a stronger, more resilient sense of identity was reborn. Experiencing psychosis was simultaneously destructive to identity and a space for the rebirth of a changed but strengthened sense of self. And in a paper I'll get onto in more detail in a minute, that one said there have also been applications of Kintsugi philosophy in victims of grief and loss, physical and emotional abuse, torture, I read that paper, child sexual abuse, domestic abuse, and patients with depression. I also couldn't ignore the imagery of Kintsugi and the reality of people who self-harm and have scars. I know from messages from listeners that I am not the only person who hoards with a history of self-harm, and so we may have physical scars as well as mental ones. In fact, the first time I heard of Kintsugi was years ago, and I saw a picture of it on social media and immediately saw it with a self-harm lens. It just seems so obviously connected. And while these things like abuse, depression, self-harm, grief and loss are not the same as hoarding, there is a lot of crossover with a lot of these issues, right?
Yeah, I think there is. I do think that this philosophy of repairing precious broken things, making them stronger, and more resilient, can be related to hoarding because there's so many of these vulnerabilities that are instrumental in hoarding development. I mean, I can also see why people who hoard might be attracted to the art of Kintsugi because they identify with the broken objects. What I think is super important to take note of is that this is an art that takes time, weeks, months. It takes a lot of skill, patience, dedication, resources, and care. And not all physical broken things should be repaired. You should be repaired, but not every physical bowl deserves that sort of reverence, I think. But when you do actually work with an object, the process of Kintsugi can just make it that it could be a bowl from Daiso, but it then becomes your bowl. You have inserted some of yourself into that bowl, not just by using it, but by recreating it. So it's very powerful.
I talked about the IKEA effect in a recent episode.
Oh, did you?
Because I'd found an unbuilt flat pack and I didn't know what it was, so I thought I will build it. It was only a small thing. I will build it to work out what it is and then decide whether to keep it. And I built it and I was clearly like, this is not of use to me. But also I had put something of myself into this by building it. And I was like, I'm sure there's a cognitive bias there. Sure enough.
And bingo!
The IKEA effect. Yeah.
I haven't. I've got it on my list of things to do for the newsletter, and I have never got round to it.
But speaking of crossover with all these different issues, of all the things I read, the most fascinating to me was a paper on the use of Kintsugi to help forensic psychiatry patients, which is people who have committed crime and have mental illness. This was a paper by Krista Passanen, and I think it was particularly moving because this is a group of people who are very unwell, who have almost all been victimized or been through trauma, and who are incredibly stigmatized. They have to overcome stigma and shame on multiple levels, including for the crimes they committed, as well as try to overcome their illness. And that felt relatable, even if for different reasons. So let's talk shame for a minute in connection with acceptance. So the Passanen paper said, many people feel shame connected to their emotional and psychological wounds, and Kintsugi can teach one to engage in a process of acceptance. Acceptance will help to draw strength from hurtful life experiences and to find ways to become more resilient. Kintsugi can teach people how to find beauty in their past and their scars and to become more acceptive of one's flaws, in inverted commas. And this changed attitude can also be applied towards others.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the type of therapy you specialize in is ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy. Does this link up with the acceptance aspect of ACT?
Very, very much. It definitely does. Acceptance in ACT is really very well aligned with the philosophy of Kintsugi. Life is suffering. If we can embrace the realities of life and that life is changing, life is actually change and suffering, then we can flow with life. But as I've mentioned before, we must remember acceptance is not giving up, it's not settling, it's not giving in. Acceptance is surrendering to the truth of what happened and then taking an active role in what happens next. We can't change what happened to us, good or bad. You know, some of us have had very, very good things happen to us. Some of us have had horrendous things. You can, however, proactively decide on what steps you'll take in the future with the resources you have. So it very much slots in that philosophy of Kintsugi and accepting those flaws, accepting others' flaws, which you mentioned. I think that's interesting about the mention of that in that article.
Because, that's the next question. I thought that was really interesting that we are probably all trying in some way to work on accepting our own flaws in one way or another, to some degree or another. But applying that to being accepting of others' flaws is not always something we all work on. Is that relevant in hoarding as an issue? Do you have a business that would benefit from advertising to thousands of dedicated listeners with an interest in mental health and home organisation? Therapy services, professional organisers, self-help stuff or organising services could all be helpful for my listeners. So get in touch if you'd like to chat about the options or go to overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/sponsor.
Look, I think self-compassion, which is accepting our own flaws or imperfections, does something to our brains. I mean, the evidence is there. It creates positive changes through the increased activity in the prefrontal cortex. Yep, you know, this spot up here that is in control of our emotions, our regulating our emotions, decision-making, and perspective taking. So this then allows us to be more compassionate to others around us, accepting their imperfections and then improving our relationships, because we are giving ourselves more self-compassion. It increases the activity in this area, allowing us to make all these different types of perceptions of what's out there, see things through a different lens. And then we're able to see other people for what they are, as flawed human beings, just as we are.
It's interesting because there is somebody I've known for a long time who last year caused a great deal of harm to myself and a group of our friends. Jan knows the whole story. It's not relevant to go into, but this feels relevant because yesterday she popped back up, having disappeared for a long time.
Wow.
Yes. It was a tense moment in the group chat, let's say that, where people were processing their reaction to, okay, she's back and she caused this immense harm. And some people were quite sympathetic towards her, other people were very, very critical towards her. And I looked at my own reaction and I realised that I reacted negatively to her popping back up, but only, I realised, because I don't want her to cause further harm to other people. I was also pleasantly surprised to see that I hoped she was doing well. I just felt more strongly that I needed to be protective of other people because she's arguably dangerous. But that on a level, as a person who was hurt by her and harmed by her and messed up by her, I actually didn't want harm to come to her. And that surprised me because I'm not always that generous. But
Mm,
I'm quite glad that was my reaction, let's say that.
mm, mm. It's a very interesting idea that you wanted to protect other people. Not you weren't concerned for yourself, but it was about protecting other people from her. What shall I say? Deceit. I think it's deceit. Yeah.
My primary concern was I need to protect other people from her.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
how she actually, also, I think partly it's that I believe it's a net good for the world if she's doing well and a net
Yeah.
bad for the world if she's doing badly.
Because she might do something similar again.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think she's probably more dangerous when she's not doing well.
Yeah.
So let's talk for a minute about the relationship between Kintsugi and our stuff. Another relevant theme around Kintsugi is the idea of wabi-sabi, which recognizes the beauty in the imperfect, incomplete, and impermanent. It combines wabi, meaning rustic beauty, and sabi, which translates to aged beauty. And this is very much my aesthetic, so I was very excited about this. Miranda Ridgway and colleagues say Kintsugi teaches conscious care, a direct contrast to the tendencies of modern consumerism. And an article on a Substack called That's Philosophical said, this philosophy is basically a celebration of use. Kintsugi is not, I'd better keep this broken thing because I can fix it one day. I feel like it's about not seeing new and shiny as the only worthwhile stuff, first of all. I know I much prefer an old battered book from a charity shop that's been well read to a brand new one. I feel like it's got soul. Frida Kahlo is one of my favourite artists. Her work is all about pain and she creates beauty from the hardest things. Secondly, I think Kintsugi is about taking care, being mindful, and engaging with our things, not piling them up and ignoring them forever. Am I leaping too far, or do you get that sense too?
No, that's exact. There is exactly. There is care in the selection of objects that have been designed and produced in a highly considered way that Western culture doesn't really embrace. We tend to have objects and to see objects, but Japanese beauty is discovered in the experience and the interaction between us and material things. And objects in the Japanese philosophy are to be used with a certain amount of reverence, not put away in a cupboard, to be saved for good. Therefore, if they are broken, there is a desire to repair that item so it can continue serving us into the future. So there's that continuity of it. There's the understanding that there is an impermanence, that things do break, things do change. But there's also that opportunity to repair that broken object and make it useful and beautiful again. But I think we just have too many objects to truly engage with. So they don't kind of become part of our life experience. You know, I think in the westernization of Japan, there's a lot of young people who are following, unfortunately, the more Western consumerist ways. But when you are there, you can see all around you. It's just this magical kind of considered approach to how their spaces feel. It's never perfect. It's never a perfection thing. It's never square. Modernism is a square box, but wabi sabi, or this type of concept, is very much a smooth bowl with some pattern or ridges or imperfect elements to it. It's so hard to describe, but in traditional Japanese architecture, I mean, materials are selected firstly for their quality, where they're sourced, their texture, and even their smell. So cedar and things like that. It's very much an encompassing sort of use of materials. It really is difficult to define. So I do recommend, I read this quite a while ago now, but Beth Kempton's book, Wabi Sabi, Japanese Wisdom for a Perfectly Imperfect Life. She explores this a bit further because she's got a lot to say about simplification and beautification of our spaces and creating what she calls pockets of serenity. I call pieces of peace, but pockets of serenity and beauty in your home, really using those concepts of wabi sabi. So I do recommend that book. It's good. It's worth a read.
And kintsugi isn't just an idea to philosophize about over a coffee in a nice cafe. People are applying it as a form of therapy too. One study looked at kintsugi and young people who were experiencing shame. The participants were asked to create artwork, destroy it, and then use the pieces to either repair it or create something new. And they analysed the data to see how that was for the participants. And the study says overall, the results showed that this directive was effective in evoking feelings of resiliency and self-forgiveness. And Krista Passanen, who did that forensic psychiatry paper, talks about a kintsugi course for forensic psychiatry patients. And the goals are to build up self-compassion, compassion, and acceptance. And she talks about a combination of mechanisms in kintsugi that achieve this, including the metaphor of kintsugi, experiential learning, a non-hierarchy approach, so the therapist kind of took part and also disclosed as well. It wasn't a kind of teacher and pupil situation, and a peer support worker who'd been through the process before and went back in to talk about their own experience. All of those to create the conditions for self-compassion, compassion, and acceptance. How might listeners who hoard and people who support people who hoard use these mechanisms and themes in our healing?
When I read this, I think this is an amazing way of the idea of creating something to destroy and rebuild is so powerful because it taps into this issue in hoarding of perfectionism and not wanting to make mistakes and feeling like you won't do it right.
Yeah.
Which is core to hoarding, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
This is something I've tried to work on with clients. And I actually think this would be a wonderful exercise for both of us to do. And as you say, that non-hierarchical approach would actually help a lot because I would be engaging as well. It would be me too. I would be making, essentially making a fool of myself by doing some ugly art and, rebuilding it. But I do feel I can see how that would really benefit. And because kintsugi is look, I mean, the processes are ancient and, you've got to have all the right tools. This is a brilliant way to do it at home. The other thing that I've tried with clients, but I haven't had much success, there's a book called Wreck This Journal.
I recommend this book all the time.
Do you?
Talk about it. It's very exciting. I do, yes.
Oh, I love it. So I have this issue myself. And a block for art is that, it won't be good enough. It won't look as good as what other people do. And so therefore the blank white page just freaks me out. So, and the kids as well, when the kids were little, I saw this book and I thought, that's brilliant. That will hopefully open them up to try some things. It didn't. It opened me up to try some things. But each page is like an invitation to wreck the page. So it might be poke holes in this page. There might be
tear it out really messily.
Yeah.
Scribble on it, rub some soil on it.
Yeah, exactly. Stick things that fly on this page. I think they're trying to encourage you to catch every mosquito that's bitten you and pop it on there with sticky tape or something. But and there's a whole world of it on the internet. If you want to see what other people have done, it's kind of a bit of a cult.
It's liberating.
Oh, I love it.
As somebody who won't write in certain notebooks because I will invariably spoil them, It's a shift. We've been brought up, most people, to take good care of books. And this is a book telling you to take really bad care of it. I think one of the days is like, kick the book around a bit.
Yeah. Take it out the front of your house and kick it up and down the road or something. It's so brilliant.
That's it. And it's such a shift for your brain to make. But when you can do it, it is liberating.
It is liberating. And it's that I don't have to be perfect. This example that you've just described is wonderful because it's about even just getting them to create something is hard. But getting someone to destroy what they've created and create something new from that, rebirth, is hard. But I think it could be exceptionally effective in letting people see, this could be a metaphor for you and your healing journey.
And like you say, a lot more kind of accessible than full-on traditional Kintsugi courses.
Kintsugi, because the whole thing is... Yeah. It's awesome, but it's protracted. It's not a simple process.
I also like that Kintsugi doesn't suggest that we can dust ourselves off and be the same as we were before we were damaged. Pasternak says, restoration infers that one can reconstruct, reclaim, rebuild, and reconnect, while accepting that trauma is life-changing. It cannot be the same as before. However, this does not mean it needs to be worse than before. It could also be better. And this feels real to me as somebody with some really messy points in my life and my history. We need to know that even if we can't be the same again, we can still be okay or even good.
This is the acceptance of suffering, change, and a oneness with all things, like those 3 Buddhist marks of existence. I think with Kintsugi, the beauty is in the care taken by someone to not only fix, repair, rebuild something, but it's also in the highlighting of the fractures that truly make it unique. This is what is really important. There is beauty in imperfection and impermanence, the fleeting nature of things, which I love about Japan. They're all about cherry blossom and maple leaves, and it's this one step in time, one moment in time, this 1 week in a particular month. One thing to note with the tradition of Kintsugi, there is a way of doing it that involves replacing any missing pieces. If you've got a bowl that you're trying to repair or a plate, replacing those missing pieces with those from another broken piece of objects to make it whole again and even more unique and even more beautiful. And I think that's interesting to contemplate, that not only might you be better and more beautiful in your imperfection, but you might be fundamentally different. You might have added something. You might be
Yes, and yourself.
It might be a plus. Yes, and yourself. Exactly.
In a Psychology Today article, Nafis Alam points out that gold, of course, costs substantially more than clay. I hadn't thought of this aspect of it till I read that. There's something really meaningful in considering the value of repairing something of low value like broken clay with something of high value like gold. As L'Oreal ads used to say, because we're worth it.
Exactly. Because we're worth it. We are worth it.
We are. And listener, I know you're thinking, except me, but you are worth it too.
You're worth it. You are worth it. Definitely.
This podcast started as an outlet for myself, but hundreds of thousands of downloads later, it's somehow become much more than that to a lot of people. I hear from people that me talking about my experiences and interviewing specialists and experts is helping them too. Hearing those stories makes the time and cost absolutely worth it. But if you want to help to ensure that the future of the podcast is sustainable, you can donate to help with costs. To send a one-off or recurring donation, just go to overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/donate. Thank you. Navarro's weird book says, in a moment of clarity, repairing what is broken is an exercise of courage because it means accepting that you might break again. And that is hard. I often get defeatist, thinking, even if I can get through this thing, there'll be another thing. And that is a thought that instantly flattens me. But when we think of Kintsugi and our own cracks and scars in terms of courage and resilience, that's empowering. Navarro also says, don't forget that in your scar, in the proof of your strength, you will find the anchoring you so need when in dire circumstances. Find in your beautified scar the impulse you need, the energy that characterizes you, and the courage you have always had. And I think that is a lovely visual to focus on. We've done a whole episode on resilience before, but can you summarize what Kintsugi tells us about our own resilience?
I think this idea, the art of Kintsugi, is a wonderful metaphor for life. Embrace the journey. All things are unique and breakage is not the end. And pieces don't mean you will never be whole again. You must take action to examine the pieces and do the work to put them back together. And as we said earlier, that's a process that needs to be gently taken and not rushed. And you could be stronger than before. But I also kind of have Leonard Cohen in my head when I was doing all of this, and I was like, ring the bells that still can ring, forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything, and that's how the light gets in. And I just reckon that's kind of sums it up, really. There has to be a crack. There has to be something different. And we can be put back together again in a more beautiful way, every one of us.
Absolutely. I can't really add to that. It's, kind of perfect. It is extra question time, Jan. This is the bit where I ask guests an extra question. It's sometimes a slightly silly one, and Hoarding darlings get access to this extra question and the answer. If you would like to become a Hoarding darling, to get access to the extra question and some extra stuff from me every month, go to overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/darling. So, Jan, our mutually favourite question every time. If people want to find you on the vast interweb, where can they do so?
You could. I'm really not keen on X anymore. I'm just really over it. But you can, if you want, at stuff_ology, or Instagram, which I'm more happy with as a platform, at stuff_ology. Or you could go to Facebook, which I don't spend much time anymore, Stuffology Consulting, or drop me a line, Jan, at stuffology.com.au, and cruise on over to the website, stuffology.com.au, and sign up for the newsletter. Weekly on a Sunday. It is free. For now, who knows what the future may bring. But I love to hear from you.
And as ever, I strongly advocate for the newsletter as a way of getting insight into hoarding, whether you are listening because you hoard or because you love somebody who hoards or you work with people who hoard. Jan's weekly email has some very insightful gems in it. I recommend it.
Excellent.
Thank you very much, Jan. Very much appreciate you coming on.
Take care, and I appreciate you. May we take a moment to reflect on the meaning of place and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we record and listen to this podcast today. I'm speaking on the lands of the Boon Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and I acknowledge their connection to country, both land and sea, and culture. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples listening today.
It's the bit where that hoarder shouts out someone wise.
Shout out this week to the especially wise Carolyn Spring and her podcast Conversations with Carolyn Spring. Have a listen to this.
What do you need? And it's that question right in that moment of being flooded by overwhelm that I ask myself, what do I need? Such a strange and novel question, such a weird question, and such a why are you even asking this question based on my upbringing? So I've had to learn to ask it, and that's not come naturally to me. And what I found is that when I do ask it, instinctively now, my hand moves to my chest, and I just place it over my heart, and somehow, for me at least, that alone is really comforting. Because it speaks to me of having compassion for myself in that moment rather than what I did for 3 or 4 decades of beating myself up for finding life hard. No, life is hard. And when those feelings come of just how hard it is and maybe even how impossible it seems to be to continue to live it, then what I need more than anything is someone who says to me, I get it. I'm sorry it's so hard. I'm with you. The only person who's always with me, who can always respond perfectly, is me. Yes, like I said earlier, ideally we need someone else too, an external person, a real person, someone to counteract that sense in that moment that there's nobody there. But if me is all I've got, then at least I'll be there for myself in that moment. And that's what I've learned, and of course am still learning, to do.
I think that's something we can take away with us. Okay, thank you for listening, and I will speak to you next time. Thank you for listening to That Hoarder Overcome Compulsive Hoarding podcast. It's been a pleasure to have you on board. You can find all the links I've mentioned and a transcript of the episode online at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk. To find out more about how you can support this podcast and the overall project, go to overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/support and do subscribe to the podcast so you make sure you don't miss any future episodes. There may be links in this podcast that earn me money. This doesn't come at any extra cost to you if you make a purchase through those links, and it helps to support the podcast.